Welcome to It's a Woman's World, a show which discusses topics of interest to women worldwide. Here's our producer, Nadia Jordana.
Hello, I'm Nadia Jordana, and you're watching It's a Woman's World. Our topic today is a very important one, the subject of white privilege and what that means to different people from different walks of life. Jamela Pettiford is our moderator, so let's go meet Jamela and the rest of the panelists. All right then, take it away, Jamela.
Welcome to It's a Woman's World, where we get a chance to explore all of the great issues concerning women. I want to welcome all of my co-hosts to be with me today, and I want to say thank you. Let's start with you, Nadia Jordana.
I'm really glad to be here today and talk about this most important subject.
Yes. And Midge Bubani.
Yes, it's a pleasure to be here today, and I too am really looking forward to this conversation.
Yes. And Lynn Garthwaite.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for including me. This is going to be really interesting.
Yes, it will. Candy Pettiford, welcome.
Well, yes, I am glad to be here. I know we're going to have a good time, you guys, and the time is going to go by so fast.
As it always does. And Ali Nathani, welcome, Ali.
Hey, Jamela, welcome. It's so good to see you all and be with you on the Zoom platform and discuss this so timely and important topic. Looking forward to it.
Me too. And I am your host, Jamela Pettiford. And you might say, what is this timely topic that these ladies are so eager to speak about? Well, we are in a time in which we are talking about white privilege. And we are talking about all of the many faces and the different ways that white privilege presents itself. And what do we see and understand white privilege to be? So let's just go ahead and jump right into it. What is white privilege?
Why don't you go ahead, Nadia?
You know, I grew up, this might be a nice place to start with me because I grew up not having a clue what white privilege was. And I don't know that even that phrase was being spoken when I was a kid, but it was there. It's existed all this time, but I didn't have a clue. I grew up in Midwestern Minnesota in an all-white school. We didn't even have Native American kids in our school. They were probably on the reservation. So I had zero exposure and knew nothing until I went to the big city, got a job, and started getting around town and learning a little bit. And I still, until I was older, did not have a concept of white privilege. And it was a surprise, a complete surprise to me the first time I heard the phrase and had to try to wrap my head around that such a thing even existed.
Mm-hmm.
I think I had a similar background, Nadia. I grew up in a farming community about 90 miles west of the metro area. And the first time I really interacted with people of color was when I went to college, and I went to Mankato State and had college classes and on various cultures. And when I did post bachelor's work, I also took classes and was in California. So I was living in a lot more diverse area. And I always was quite aware of white privilege after that. I guess it didn't dawn on me until when I was a young adult.
And I think I can add the same story. I think I was well into my 30s, maybe even 40s, when I read one of those reports where they had come out with they'd done an experiment with submitting applications for jobs, two identical applications you know, the same schooling, the same job history, kind of the same experiences, just changed the names. And one had a more ethnic sounding name, I guess, a Black sounding name, and one had a more Anglo sounding name. And in 99% of the times, only the one with the Anglo name was called in for an interview. And that was just one of those kind of astounding head slapping moments for me. Just couldn't imagine it.
Yeah.
Well, I grew up in an all white town, believe it or not. We were the only African-American family in Lindstrom, Minnesota. But as I was talking to my husband about white privilege, he said, you know, it's really a myth. And I said, what do you mean by a myth? He says, it comes from white supremacy, that you are better because I'm white, I am better than. And then I kind of thought about, you know, this pandemic does not say, you are white, and so I will not attack you. And so I thought, we're all of the human race. So it really, white privilege really is a myth.
Mhm. And I have to say too, I mean, even growing up in the Twin Cities, and I'd have to say most of my community growing up was predominantly African American, growing up in Rondo community, 2-parent homes, families, you know, educated folk. We didn't talk about white privilege either. It wasn't until, you know, I started going into schooling and being more in the work world that I started to hear more about white privilege. It made total sense. I mean, I'd seen examples of it throughout my life, but it was never coined with the terminology of white privilege. It was just something that we just knew was the way it was. And we didn't have necessarily a name for it. And so even growing up, much like all of you, however, growing up in predominantly African-American community, we didn't use it either. And so it was something that has been coined, I think, within the past 20 years, and something that has been, you know, what we've known to be true. We now had a label and a way to speak to it and identify it. So, yeah.
Yeah, I also, so being from India, from an immigrant community, you know, grew up primarily in a white school, private school in South Minneapolis. And until I heard this concept and I think the author was Peggy McIntosh, where she has a publication called Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. It was in the 80s. And I read that and I was like, wow, that's kind of where my awakening was like, oh, that does kind of make sense. It was like, as a child, I think you sense things, but you can't logically put some things together and why things are the way they are, right? So when I read some of the pieces that she wrote about this, I was like, well, this does make a lot of sense. And I think the other thing that I just still find interesting in this time we're in is, you know, we know the studies, we know students of color, you know, how often do we hear in public school systems or school systems as a whole, children of color are behind by X percentage, or even with the virus, there's a disproportionate amount of people, you know, who are affected by this virus. And so when you think of even, you know, thinking about the vaccination and who got to have it first. Well, you know, certainly the elderly, which I think is absolutely right, should have had it first. But then we know the studies say that people of color, especially from the Black community, have higher incidence. So how about making sure those folks are prioritized too? And so I think the point I'm getting at is, you know, we have enough studies, enough research about some of the disparities that we see that was even called out in the resume, you know, that in the hiring where we talked about that earlier. So let's do something about this now. We know enough.
Mm-hmm. And with that being said, I mean, is it possible for those who hold this privilege to allow others to have privilege as well? I think that's the question of equity. Because if I hold this privilege, what happens if I give it away? What happens if I make it fair for others? What happens if I acknowledge that white privilege has spawned this 400 years of enslavement in this country that has now brought about the disparities that Black folks have had? We didn't have these disparities in Africa before we were taken, you know?
Right.
So these are the disparities that were created by white supremacy and by white privilege. So in this understanding of how we got to the ghettos, how we got to the gap in education, how we got to the increase in crime rate, how we got to the fatherless children, this all started with white supremacy. So are we able to have that conversation? Definitely,
but I think the problem is that the white supremacy is so embedded that there's a large portion of people that won't admit, they won't admit that there's white privilege and that they're even racist. They won't admit it.
Very good.
And I've read things on Facebook from friends that say that 99.9% of the people are colorblind. Well, you know,
No.
and that, you know, all this. So I actually responded to her in a message saying I totally disagree with that. And it was like she was posting stuff I couldn't even. I just stopped. You know, I took her off my Facebook because I can't take it. But what can we do? I mean, we have to elect people in power that will make a change. But you look at legislatures and heads of corporations and all this, most of them are white. Yeah. So we have to elect people of color and people that will make a change.
And it is our white community that should shoulder the responsibility of being proactive. We just have to. If we don't do that little bit, it makes a big difference. I have a little bit of an ethnic sounding name, and I remember applying for a job, and this was almost racism in reverse. They were apparently trying to fill a quota, and I got called in for a job interview, and she raised an eyebrow and said, "I thought you'd have dark hair and brown eyes." So I know she was looking for a Hispanic or Middle Eastern, because my name kind of crosses both those borders. I still got the job because white privilege. Right. They had to go looking for what they were still looking for. But I found that was my first light bulb moment.
Well, I had a light bulb moment when my husband told me he was trying to sell his boat, and he brought the guy with him who was white that was going to buy the boat. So he's standing at the bank. Excuse me. He's standing at the bank, and the lady teller looks and she says, "So this is your boat, sir?" And my husband said, "Yes." She turned to the white guy and said, "Is this his boat?" And the white guy said, "Yes, so she was really getting okay from him because she did not believe my husband that he had such a nice boat. And this man was buying, he said, "Yeah, I want to buy it from him. So yes, this is his boat." So that's when we realized, wow, that was okayed by the white man saying, "Yeah, that is his boat." But until my husband had to be quiet and let the white man say something, it was going to be sold.
Yes, and we're seeing that all across America, even with home ownership and home buying, right? Where people are selling their homes and they're getting hundreds of thousands of dollars less in their appraisals because they're African-American families that live in the home. So they'll switch out and have, a white family put their pictures up, polls as living there, and then it goes to the market value. I wanted to speak to what you were saying too, Midge, about how we need to, elect people who are, conscious of this. But I would dare say that this trickles down into the everyday of the who of us as people and the peoplehood of us. What I have noticed, I worked for a lady, her name was Mary Hartman, and she started an organization working with families who were chemically dependent, mentally ill, long-term homeless with children. And of course, that population was higher African American families. And one day she looked at me, and she is a Caucasian woman. She looked at me and she said, "How dare I have an organization where I'm helping people of color and I won't hire people of color?" And so most of her staff were African American women, and she was determined to make that so. Even so, when she would go into the board and the board would say, she would say, "Hey, we are going to hire in an equitable way, or I'm not doing this." And what I realized is in the everyday of who white women, white men are in these spaces, you have to bring that with you. You have to have enough power, enough gumption to walk away from situations, from money. There was many fundings that she walked away from because they did not like the color of her staff, and she didn't care, because she said, "Who am I if I don't dispel this myth of white privilege in the everyday of what it is that I do?"
Wow.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
And that reminds me that I feel a lot of hope going forward in the future, because I think our younger generation, every generation seems to get a little better about this. And a lot of it has to do with the younger generation is much more likely to be in a more diverse school situation, work in more diverse, office situations or wherever they're working. So it feels like we have this upcoming generation of people who are just used to being in diverse crowds and perhaps even intermarriage and things like that. I just feel like there's a lot of hope going forward, much more than my generation, my parents' generations going back. I feel good about that. However, if younger generation people are being raised in households that are filled with that bigotry, then they're not going to change just because they work next to somebody of a different color.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think this conversation is really important to focus on. So, and I agree with you, Lynn. I mean, I think there's a lot of hope for the future, but, there's been some comparisons to the 1960s and to where we are today. And what really has changed? I mean, if you really dissect that down, and not to bring the downcast on this conversation, but when I hear that, I'm like, yeah, what is it? So what is it, as you were talking about the white community, I think, Mitch, before, I often wonder if it is, it is the white community who has to say enough and really gather community within the white community. So what I mean by that is I often hear of some of the concepts of the fear and what is it that people are fearful of? And this big notion of white supremacy, which I believe is real with the KKK and all those forces, but who in the white community is going to say enough to them too? And I think it has to start there. And I just don't see us as people of color being able to end that. I think it's the unification within the white community itself that will stop it. And the next point I just want to raise is we can continue to try to put people of color in positions of leadership, which I think is right on. But we also have to remember there often gets a lot shouldered on that person. And it's the systems that they are continually fighting and often fighting alone. And I think this point doesn't get made enough. So Jamela, for the person that you were talking about who actually took a stand,
She did.
That's what a lot of the work has to be focused on. And I think also the last thing I'll say is any one of us can start to make this change. We don't have to wait for politicians. Start doing it yourself.
Very well said.
You are absolutely right.
And look at speaking about the children, walk into a department store, try to buy a doll or an action figure for a child of color.
Oh.
And who are these business people who don't think that there's a market there for that, and not just for families of color, but for white families too? Gee, I know my grandkids, I found a pretty little doll of color in their toy box that they were playing with. I thought, what a refreshing thing to see in that toy box. But it's almost impossible to walk down the store shelves a couple weeks into the holiday season and whatever was there is all gone.
When I think about Harriet Tubman, when I think about all of the great folks who helped to abolish slavery, it was white folks as well. They were very powerfully involved, risking their lives, risking their housing, risking their family to make sure that this America was equitable for everyone. And it will take that again. And when I think about the Quakers, when I think about the abolitionists and all of the folks who really said, hey, we're just not going for any of this. This is why we are where we are right now, because white voices, white minds, white intellects came together and said, this is unacceptable. It's immoral. It's not fair. We're not going to do this any longer. And I really believe that we are at that impasse again.
And I think
Yeah,
that
I
was
think your point is well said, Jamela, that it takes all of us, white brothers and sisters, all of us to come together. It's not about us being against each other. And after the George Floyd incident, I mean, what, really, like, it was such an awakening. Like, what more do you need to understand? Like, it's just, as Jamela said, the concepts of this is humanely just not the right way to treat people. And the thing I think that a lot of people do is they want to educate themselves more. They want to join book clubs, which I think is great. But you know what we need more than more education? We need action. We need people to do exactly what Jamela is saying. There is enough learning. You know enough. We know enough about the research. Now go do something about it.
Yes.
one thing I found nice about the George Floyd protest, movement. There were considerable numbers of white people in the crowds. And this was quite different from what we've seen before. So it did feel like this was a turning point. I mean, it was such an appalling act that had happened right in front of our eyes that it just drew out many more people than before. So maybe this will be looked back on in time as a turning point.
And speaking of that, my brother is a policeman, a retired policeman. And he was carrying his gun. He says, Candy, he says, I no longer carry my gun. I said, well, why? He said, I was stopped by the police. He said, a female police officer, white police officer was on my left side. He said, on my right side. He said that on my left side was the male police officer. And he rolled his window down and the male police officer said, can I have your registration? And he was about ready to say, I'm a police officer, before the female police officer yelled, he's got a gun, he's got a gun, he's got a gun. And they were about ready to shoot my brother until he said, I'm a police officer. I'm a police officer. He had to yell it. I'm a police officer. Because that could have happened to him just like Orlando Castile.
Yes. Yeah, we truly are in a time in which you have to bring your voice into the HR room. You have to bring your voice into the boardrooms. You have to bring your voice to the criminal justice system. You have to bring your voice everywhere you go where you see that there is injustice happening. I really know that we are walking through the pages of history. And what will be said about you during this time? What side of history will you be on? I remember as a child, when we would have discussions about race as a kid when I was growing up, I remember, the young white folks would say, well, that was my grandparents, I didn't have anything to do with that. I didn't do anything to you guys. But now that we can all see the injustice, now that we can all see the acts of rage against Black folks, now that we can see the dilapidated educational systems that have been designed purposefully this way, now that we can see redlining and we can see all of the ways that our families were purposely destroyed and all the ways that why Black folks don't trust vaccines because of the projects that were happening to our brothers and sisters who were in the airmen, who were given syphilis, right? All of this is historical. This is all very present even now. This is a movement that really has to happen. But one of the things that I was, in my time when I think about America as a whole, there's prophecies that were put upon this land by our forefathers. And one of the prophecies is that united we stand and divided we fall. And that prophecy is very real to this day. Because if we do not get it together as a people, Black, white, and otherwise in this country, we will destroy ourselves.
Yeah.
And we will no longer be who we've all worked hard to be in this country. And so I really think it's high time that we get it together and really figure out how are we going to do this. So we have a few more minutes. I mean, where are we now? You know, we talked about the past. We talked about, you know, where are we now? How do we bring this into these difficult spaces, even if we have to stand alone?
Even if we have to start with the little things, we're the little people, start in some simple manner in your neighborhoods, in your communities. If you have access to higher levels of government, work for that. But gosh, everybody, nobody can be left out if they're living in a community. There are things in your community you can do. Get started there. You'll find other things to grow into.
Absolutely.
Even in your own family, you can start it out. Even in your own family,
even in your own family discussions
that are prejudiced or racist.
Even in your church communities, because one of the things that we know is that Sunday morning is one of the most segregated days of the week, where each one of us go to our own respective culture groups and we do as we do. In those spaces where we claim to be moral, do we bring the moralism of this to our church community, to our larger bodies, where we are talking about the temperature of this country? So I just want to say that this is the time not only to have these conversations, but to bring the active movement of how you can bring the change so that you are on the right side of history. Because all of these days that we are in currently, they are being written. Yes, and we are walking through the pages of history currently.
Well said. Yeah.
Well said. So white privilege, the myth, the legend. How do we now dispel, break up, and change this narrative so that we as American people can go forward to continue to be the amazing superpower that we have been for hundreds of years? It took all of us, and it will take all of us again. I want to thank you for being with us today. This is what we do with It's a Woman's World. We have candid conversations. I want to give you an afterthought. Have this conversation in your home with the people you care about. What is it that you can do to bring about a new you, a new neighborhood, and of course, a new America? Thank you for being with us again. I'm Jamela Pettiford. I'm your host, and we will see you again on It's a Woman's World. Bye-bye.